Thank you so much, Hugo. It's great to be back here with my friends at VOR to talk about my new book, Chasing the Intact Mind: How the Severely Autistic and Intellectually Disabled Were Excluded from the Debates That Affect Them Most. And this book is coming out in October, being published by Oxford University Press. So I'm sure that, especially as we get closer and in the months after, I'll be giving lots of book talks. Well, I hope I will. At least I hope there's interest in the argument that I'm making in this book. It's kind of like my manifesto. I don't know if I've written 2 previous books, but this really kind of articulates my issues with current disability rhetoric and the harm I think that it's posing for those with severe intellectual and developmental disabilities. But I don't think any book talk or event I'll be doing in the next few months will be to an audience that truly gets it, like every single person on this Zoom meeting. So I've really been looking forward to this discussion. I really appreciate being asked to share this. Many of you probably recognize my son, Jonah. He's 24 now. He's severely autistic, intellectually disabled, minimally verbal, and epileptic. His aggressive and self-injurious behaviors were so bad when he was younger that he was hospitalized for almost a year at the Kennedy Krieger Institute when he was only 9. And he's been medically stabilized for about 13 years now, which is fantastic. But his life is still very constrained by his significant cognitive impairment. He'll never have a meaningful career or a romantic relationship. He'll never see the world. In fact, he has no idea what the world is or what is out there besides home, school, and some of his favorite places like Costco or the water park. I can't even imagine, honestly, what Jonah's inner life is like, although I try all the time. I mean, what his inner life is like without any abstract concepts. He doesn't understand life or death. He has no awareness or understanding of history or literature or geography or politics. Which, okay, fine, maybe in some small way he is better off. It's a surreal time to be the parent or sibling of someone with severe autism. There has been infighting within the autism community since 1993, when self-advocate Jim Sinclair, the founder of the autism rights movement, which later rebranded as the neurodiversity movement, famously scolded parents not to, quote, mourn for us because the tragedy is not autism itself, but the fact that, quote, your world has no place for us to be. But the discourse has never seemed so detached from reality as it is in our present moment, when neurodiversity activists are just erasing Jonah and his peers, who represent not rare and extreme outliers, but almost 30% of the autistic population, according to recent CDC data, by insisting there is actually no such thing as severe autism. I screenshot these quotes from a range of different social media platforms. I could have spent the entire presentation sharing similar ones with you. And unbelievably, this claim is being platformed not just on social media, because we all know there are millions of trolls on social media. You can't get too worked up about what anonymous voices on social media are saying, but this is in prestigious medical journals like Pediatrics. These articles here, all by neurodiversity advocates, literally instruct researchers and clinicians about what words they're allowed and not allowed to use to describe their autistic subjects and patients. And unsurprisingly, the bad words, the words that are dismissed as ableist and offensive, are all words that parents of autistic kids and the professionals who treat them routinely use. So this particular table is from Kristen Botema-Butel et al. And her colleagues, and was published in Autism in Adulthood. But I could have shown you any of the tables because they're all very similar. You'll notice that functioning labels are not allowed. You can't mention challenging or disruptive behavior. You can't talk about the severity of symptoms or support needs. You can't mention comorbid conditions or risk or even treatment. You can't talk about treatment. That's offensive and ableist, apparently. Instead, the authors call for neutral or even strength-based replacements, like talking about features or traits. If there's one thing that unites everyone in this Zoom room right now, it's the understanding that severe cognitive impairment, whether due to autism, Down syndrome, or some other intellectual or developmental disability, is not a strength. We're all familiar with the dangerous behaviors that often plague this population. I know families whose children live in helmets and arm stays because if they're allowed to bend their arms, they will hit themselves in the face hundreds of times an hour until they detach their own retinas. Imagine writing grant proposals or trying to publish research targeting that agitation, those self-injurious and destructive behaviors. And imagine the discursive contortions required to avoid all these words, to avoid talking about behavior that's challenging, to avoid talking about psychopathology that drives it. You're not allowed to use any of those words. So my colleagues, Allison Singer and Alicia Halliday from the Autism Science Foundation, and Jill Escher, who is the president of NCSA and who is here today, hi Jill, published a response in Autism Research. We had 3 main points. Well, first we said autism is defined as a disorder by the DSM and experienced as such by tens of millions of people around the world. So medicalized language is both completely necessary and entirely appropriate. It's not, as so many neurodiversity advocates have argued, dehumanizing. In fact, I have a lot of problems with how this word is constantly deployed by neurodiversity advocates, not just in the context of these language guides, but pretty much in all the debates I've gotten involved with related to severe autism. In fact, I wrote a piece back in 2016 for Psychology Today called "I don't think that word means what you think it means," quoting from my favorite movie, The Princess Bride, and it was definitely one of my snarkier titles. Generally, I try to be civil in these debates, but sometimes I just can't help myself. But as I wrote then, and as I still believe, straight talk about life at the severe end of the spectrum is, quote, only dehumanizing if such impairments are not part of the human experience, as say breathing underwater or laying eggs are not. What is actually dehumanizing is implying that those impairments are too shameful or too disturbing to be publicly shared. Our second point was about the chilling effect on autism research. This is already happening. We know researchers who have seen their grant proposals and articles returned for revision or even rejected simply for violating neurodiversity language guidelines. And young researchers who understandably don't like being attacked are reconsidering their choice of specialization. We know that the amount of research focused on the severe end of the spectrum has dropped by 2/3 since the 1990s. Blatant censorship will only exacerbate this trend. And finally, we made the completely, I think, common sense point that no faction should speak for the entire autism community. In no way do we deny that some autistics see their diagnosis as an identity rather than a disorder. And in fact, we wrote in our commentary that researchers whose work focuses on this end of the spectrum should absolutely honor those preferences. But the authors of these language guides write as if they represent the perspective of the entire autism community, when in fact they represent the most capable, those who can fill out surveys, participate in interviews, and write journal articles. None of these authors consulted, to my knowledge, any parents of profoundly autistic individuals who would doubtlessly have articulated the need for a similarly broad vocabulary to accurately depict such heterogeneous experiences. One thing we didn't talk about in our commentary, and what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my time, is where did this idea come from that there is no such thing as severe autism? That all that separates very mildly impacted self-advocates like Ari Neiman, the founder of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and my son Jonah, is that Ari can communicate, but Jonah is trapped inside his autism. In other words, where did this intact mind assumption in autism come from, and why is it so powerful? So let's start by defining what exactly I mean by the intact mind. This is a recurring theme in autism discourse in which a seemingly profoundly cognitively impaired individual is assumed to have, or even revealed to have, a typical or even genius intellect. The critical elements of the intact mind are its integrity and its inaccessibility, at least at first. In other words, there was a profound disjunct between the child's inappropriate, destructive, or even aggressive behaviors and the capable self hidden deep inside. The intact mind goes under many different names. I borrowed this phrase from Portia Iverson's 2006 memoir, Strange Sons, because I thought it best and most efficiently captured both the profound hopes of parents and the massive stakes for their children's indeterminate futures. But I just as easily could have adopted one of the phrases used by other authors, such as the real child, the normal child, the intelligent child trapped inside, or the visually apt but prohibitively wordy person locked inside a closet at the top of a collapsed stairway in a boarded up house that's hidden by overgrown vines, down a driveway blocked by deadfall on a street bypassed by the highway. A close runner-up to the intact mind for me was psychologist Brenna Siegel's articulation of the homunculus, what she calls the homunculus theory in autism, which, quote, holds that inside each intellectually disabled child with autism, that there is a normally developed being. What's astounding about this trope is its pervasiveness and persistence across my primary archive, which was autism parent memoirs. I focused on this literature because it really is through these narratives that the intact mind is amplified and absorbed into public perceptions about autism. As we'll see, intact mind imagery is foregrounded in the very first autism parent memoir, Clara Claiborne Park's The Siege, which was published in 1967 and continues to this day. These are just a few early examples. We'll look at some later examples in a bit. So Barry Neil Kaufman, in his 1976 book Sunrise, talks about the signs that hinted at the vast field of intelligence that we felt existed beneath the surface of Ron's bizarre patterns. James Copeland, For the Love of Anne, wrote, there must be a key somewhere. If they could find it, then they could unlock the door to that troubled mind. Joan Martin Hunley was an Australian writer, wrote in her memoir, The Small Outsider, published in 1971, life with an autistic child is the feeling that the child is cut off by a glass wall, that his mind is beyond our reach. And finally, Josh Greenfeld, in the first of his trilogy of books about his son Noah, wrote, quote, there is an opaque barrier, a filter or a gel that he places within himself and the world. Noah is still very much enclosed in a world of his own, whose latch he makes not even the slightest attempt to jiggle. Okay, so I don't know that Hugo mentioned this. What my PhD is in the history of medicine. So now I'm going to take you on a bit of a historical journey to kind of show you where I think this idea of the intact mind came from. Importantly, this isn't anything biologically true about autism, but this is a historically contingent trope that emerges from certain very popular discourses. But before I get into that, I want to talk about very briefly other memoirs of other types of intellectual disability, because the idea of the intact mind is completely absent from these other books written by parents of children with other types of intellectual disabilities, such as these very early and extraordinarily popular bestsellers by Pearl Buck about her daughter with PKU, and Dale Evans Rogers, who with her cowboy husband, Roy Rogers, had a daughter with Down syndrome who died at the age of 2. These accounts began appearing in 1950, almost 20 years before the first autism parent memoirs. While they were truly groundbreaking in their celebration of the humanity of intellectually disabled children and the value they bring to their families and communities, it's not because of any hope of an intact mind. These mothers are very frank about their children's disabilities, but love them anyway. Quote, mind is not all of the human creature, Buck gently reminds us. All people are equal in their humanity and all have the same human rights. None is to be considered less as a human being than any other, and each must be given his place and safety in the world. And I only cite this because I think it shows so nicely that there are other ways of positively engaging with intellectual disability that don't require us to pretend it doesn't exist. So if the intact mind isn't a biological fact, but a product of its history, where did it come from? Leo Kanner introduced the disorder he originally called autistic disturbances of affective contact in a 1943 paper describing 11 young patients who shared, quote, a basic desire for aloneness and sameness that he felt was markedly and uniquely different from anything reported so far. Although today we classify autism as a developmental disability like Down syndrome or spina bifida, Kanner considered it a psychiatric condition closely related to, or for some of his peers, interchangeable with childhood schizophrenia. So it's important to look at the psychiatric context in which Kanner made his intervention. By the late 1930s, American psychiatry was largely governed by the principles of psychoanalysis, which located the source of all mental illness in childhood trauma. Inevitably, this meant blaming parents, but especially mothers, for these conditions. In 1941, Margaret Ribble proposed that inadequate mothering caused, quote, serious privation reactions, which appear to be the basis of emotional disorders in the older child than in the adult. 7 years later, Beta Rank, pictured here on the left, argued that her young patients uniformly, quote, suffered gross emotional deprivation at the hands of a dangerous mother who was emotionally disturbed, narcissistic, and immature. That was the same year Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, on the right of this slide, famously introduced the schizophrenogenic mother, who created profound psychopathology through her, quote, severe early warp and rejection of her kids. Kanner initially rejected this narrative. In fact, he wrote an entire book called In Defense of Mothers, How to Bring Up Children in Spite of the More Zealous Psychologists, which was published 2 years before his seminal article on autism, and which absolutely shredded psychoanalysis as, quote, an unproven, arbitrarily decreed psychology, he uses quotes there, based on, quote, the myth of the GGU, which was his term for the great God unconscious. Kanner lamented, quote, there is no raid shelter from the verbal bombs that rain on contemporary parents. At every turn, they run against weird words and phrases which are apt to confuse and scare them to no end. Oedipus complex, maternal rejection, repression, regression, aggression, blah, 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 and more blah, blah. Yes, as a matter of fact, that's a technical term used by the man who virtually invented the field of child psychiatry, blah, blah. And when it came time to hypothesize a cause for his new disorder, Kanner absolved the parents and posited, quote, an innate inability to form the usual biologically provided affective contact with people. Autistic kids were just born that way, he believed at first. But Kanner was not able to withstand the psychoanalytic tide for long. By 1949, he was arguing that, quote, most of the patients were exposed from the beginning to parental coldness, obsessiveness, and a mechanical type of attention to material needs only. They were kept neatly in refrigerators which did not defrost. Their withdrawal seems to be an active turning away from such a situation to seek comfort in solitude. This represented a monumental shift in Kanner's thinking. Not only was autism caused by parents now, rather than a condition kids were born with, as he had first proposed, but those parents were so terrible, so heartless, that their kids freely chose a life of incomprehensible, dangerous, and disabling symptoms rather than engage with them. And this was not a passing theory. In 1954, Kanner turned to the parents to answer the question with which he titled a paper, "To what extent is early infantile autism determined by constitutional inadequacies?" Not too much, he concluded. Not only did his patients have few psychotic relatives, which one would expect if heredity were to blame, but Kanner emphasized the, quote, emotional refrigeration the children experienced at the hands of frigid mothers who offered, quote, mechanized service of the kind which is rendered by an over-conscientious gasoline station attendant. And he used the same language at a 1955 symposium where he described, quote, the common lot of autistic children as one of emotional refrigeration, using that language again. Kanner may have originated the refrigerator mother trope, but it was most famously popularized by Austrian Bruno Bettelheim, who was a survivor of both Dachau and Buchenwald and went on to become the director of the Sonia Shankman Orthogenic School, a residential program for emotionally disturbed kids at the University of Chicago. Although he had been publishing his case studies since 1950, Bettelheim's ideas were most fully developed in his best-selling 1967 book, The Empty Fortress, which elaborated his comparison of autistic children to traumatized concentration camp prisoners and firmly concluded, quote, the precipitating factor in infantile autism is the parent's wish that his child should not exist. After his 1990 suicide, it would be discovered that Bettelheim actually had no training or expertise in psychology or psychiatry. He had earned his doctorate in art history, and before World War II had managed his family's lumber business. But his ideas were extraordinarily influential in the mid-20th century. The empty fortress was excerpted or profiled in some of the most prominent national publications, including the New York Times, the Saturday Evening Post, and the New Yorker. He was even a guest on the Dick Cavett Show. And his views about autism were accepted with little question, that autism was caused by unloving parents, but that it could be cured by removing the child from the home, what Bettelheim called a parentectomy, and placing him in the care of a good therapist. This was the landscape when Clara Claiborne Park published the first autism parent memoir, The Siege, in 1967. There were several factors that likely contributed to Park's desire to challenge the hegemonic mother-blaming discourse around autism. First of all, this hegemony had very recently begun to crack. In 1964, psychologist Bernard Rimland, and himself parent of an autistic kid, released Infantile Autism, the Syndrome and its Implications for a Neural Theory of Behavior, which emphatically rejected psychogenic theories of etiology and argued that the disorder was caused by a physiological impairment. Rimland would prove enormously influential in changing medical and lay understandings of autism, and Park was very familiar with his work. Her educational and professional status are also important here. Park graduated from Radcliffe, taught at a Massachusetts community college, wrote articles for the local newspaper, and was part of a lively intellectual community at Williams College, where her husband David was a physics professor. These credentials likely made Park just less intimidated overall by the professionals she encountered as she and David searched for help for their daughter Jessie, who was given the pseudonym of Ellie in the book, and less likely to submit to accusations that made no sense to her. How could her allegedly cold parenting cause Jessie's autism when her 3 older kids were completely neurotypical? It couldn't, Park argued. But we were not disposed to blame ourselves. We knew we had been the same kind of parents to Ellie as we had been to the others. Ellie had been warmed, cuddled, tickled, and loved. But as much as Park challenged the experts who blamed her for her daughter's autism, it's so important to point out that she did so in psychoanalytic language and imagery that reified this framework in public conceptions of autism going forward. It's right there in the title, The Siege, which also provides the guiding metaphor throughout the book, from the dedication, quote, to those behind walls and to all their besiegers, to this reflection in the closing chapter. Quote, of all the things that Ellie has given, the most precious is this faith, that inside the strongest citadel he can construct, the human being awaits his besieger. This last sentence is indistinguishable from those written by prominent psychoanalysts, right down to the architectural metaphors, such as Margaret Mahler, who described autism as a condition in which, quote, there is a deanimated frozen wall between the subject and the human object. Park's book ends with a declaration of victory. Quote, as a siege, it has been successful, for we have reached Ellie. This is not to say that she is indistinguishable from typical children. She still can't ride a bike or tie her shoes or chat easily with other kids, but Park's primary concern has been assuaged. Jessie is not feeble-minded, she writes. Her mind, for those aspects of the world she can make of it, is sharp and retentive, and the future is hopeful. In the penultimate chapter, Park recounts a story Jessie's psychiatrist told her about a boy, quote, who seemed much like Jessie and who ended up at Harvard. Although this arc of the recovery of the child's intact mind through the sheer will and effort of her parents would become a dominant trope in autism parent memoirs from that point to the present day, I should report that Jessie Park never made it to Harvard. More than 30 years after the siege, Clara Claiborne Park published a second memoir called Exiting Nirvana. I can't help but read this book as a deliberate corrective to the intact mind narrative that originated in the siege. Park opens by clarifying that Jessie's story, quote, has not been about a miraculous recovery, although selective narration could give that illusion. The overwhelming message is that while Jessie has made much progress, she remains significantly disabled. Gone are the references to sieges and breakthroughs and walls. Instead, we are told that Jessie will never be able to live independently, that she cannot work without supervision, that she still struggles with, quote, the limitations of autism, including strange hypersensitivities, strange obsessions, strange compulsions, strange explosive reactions. Her mind is now described as, quote, severely limited, end quote. One might even call it impaired. But most people don't read Exiting Nirvana today. It was the siege that the Autism History Project dubbed, quote, still one of the most important parent memoirs about autism. The siege that historian Marga Vicedo called, quote, a Bible for parents of autistic children who continued generation after generation to rediscover the book. And it was the trope of the siege, the fight to free the intact mind, that persisted in autism discourse rather than the much more gentle metaphor of a journey that Park adopted instead in Exiting Nirvana. What's surprising is that the intact mind proved so resilient even as biological theories of autism replaced psychoanalytic discourse in the 1970s and 1980s. Empirical reports of specific physiological abnormalities in autistic kids had begun to appear the previous decade, including findings of elevated serotonin levels, irregular EEG patterns, and the high prevalence of seizures in this population. By 1977, Michael Rutter and Susan Folstein's twin study had established a genetic component in autism, and soon new technologies such as neuroimaging were being deployed to document abnormalities in autistic brains. This new biological understanding of autism was incompatible with the psychoanalytically inspired intact mind. Michael Rutter, on the left side of this slide, had explicitly challenged this narrative as early as 1965, noting that, quote, it has sometimes been thought that all autistic children are really of normal intelligence and that intellectual brilliance always exists beneath the autistic surface of failures to speak, learn, and form relationships. Regrettably, this is not the case. Echoed Lorna Wing, pictured on the right 5 years later, quote, most parents of these children have the feeling that their child is intentionally normal and intelligent, if only they could find the key to the mystery of his strange behavior. But most autistic children have learning problems that make them generally retarded. This realignment should theoretically have left physicians and families on the same side, since it completely absolved parents of the blame levied against them by psychoanalysts. But the new medical model of autism etiology carried a decidedly unwelcome prognosis. As much as it had crushed parents to think they caused their children's often profound impairments, at least they could believe that something else could be done to reverse those effects. The psychological model, in other words, preserved hope, but biology was forever. Reeling from this grim foreclosure of their children's futures and smarting from decades of parent blaming, many parents privileged their own expertise over that of their children's practitioners. In countless memoirs from the 1990s to the present, parents lambasted the disorder's lack of biomarkers or even stable diagnostic criteria, as well as the relative lack of effective interventions for either the core deficits of autism or the catastrophic symptoms that often accompanied them, including aggressive and self-injurious behavior, pica, elopement, sleeplessness, and seizures. At the same time, they touted their own solutions in an avalanche of memoirs, programs that included a staggering variety of alternative treatments, such as auditory integration training, facilitated communication, diet, vitamins, even one book about how an autistic child was recovered from riding horses in Mongolia. And these cures were described in a very particular way that I hope looks familiar to you. These kids weren't healed per se. Their abnormal neural functioning wasn't corrected. Their fractured egos weren't restored. In all these cases, the parents described intact minds that had always been there and had been recovered through the faith and effort of their parents and sometimes providers. Here are just a few of some very recent examples. So Susan Levin in 2015 described her son Ben as a child totally imprisoned in autism. Judy Barron in 2002 wrote, there's a real child in here, he's trapped and we've got to get him out. And Valerie Gilpier wrote in a very recent book about her daughter Emily, who was liberated by using facilitated communication, wrote that Emily seemed, quote, as if she were locked inside herself. She appeared to live in an isolated space to which we had repeatedly tried to gain access and failed. She was alone in there. And in Marcia Hines' 2020 book, I Know You're in There, the title itself is kind of an assertion of the intact mind. Sometimes it feels as if we are caretakers of an absent soul. But you must remember your child really is in there. It was only later, after he recovered, that I realized he had been in there. Oops. All of which begs the question, with so many memoirs documenting its recovery, isn't the intact mind in autism real? If not, what other explanation is there for so many dramatic transformations? Let's start by eliminating some possibilities. I'm not suggesting that these parent authors are making up these stories or being deliberately deceptive in any way. I believe their description of their kids' concerning symptoms, from disengagement to lack of language to bizarre or violent behaviors, and I believe those symptoms largely resolved over time. In other words, I believe those books were written in good faith. One theory that is often circulated is that the children weren't really autistic in the first place, although virtually all of the parent authors are very defensive about this possibility. But the fact is, researchers have known that some kids lose their autism diagnoses for more than 50 years. For Michael Rutter, writing in 1970, the phenomenon was very rare, with 1.5% of adults achieving normal functioning. In 2008, however, Molly Held and her colleagues reviewed outcome studies and found that the number might be as high as 25%. A more recent paper, which appeared in 2014, split the difference, reporting recovery in 9% of autistic kids. Despite this large range, researchers' descriptions of recovered children share important similarities. Most critically, for our purposes, all had IQs in the normal range as toddlers, whereas not one of the kids with both intellectual disability and autism lost their diagnosis. And researchers freely admit they can't explain why some of the cognitively able children recovered completely while others didn't. No significant relationships have been found between recovery and type or duration of treatment kids received as toddlers. So to sum up, the children described in these memoirs may well have recovered, but it likely had little, if nothing, to do with the particular regimens espoused by their parents. They were just left. So thank you for bearing with me through this journey through history. That's the first half of my book, traces that historical journey and focuses on analysis of language. What words do we use to describe people with intellectual and developmental disabilities such as autism? And a completely reasonable response to this analysis might be, okay, sure, perhaps our cultural descriptions of autism are a tad euphemistic, but what's so bad about that? Especially when it's what so many stakeholders in the community seem to want. Not just neurodiversity activists either. In his memoir, Reasonable People, Ralph Savary's, father of a severely autistic son, cites his wife Emily's response to a cautionary claim by Lorna Wing about the limited skills of many autistic children. Emily says, quote, "What good does it to do anyone to listen to it? What might hope endanger?" And I get hope. Hope is a lifeline to the completely ordinary future all parents want for our kids. A life of virtually limitless options, from the big decisions like where to live or work to the seemingly insignificant inclination to order a pizza or just open the door and take a walk, something Jonah will never be able to do without someone with him. Accepting a child's complete and lifelong dependence can be extraordinarily difficult. It might even feel like giving up on it. But the main argument of my book is that sugarcoating autism in the name of hope has had and continues to have significant material or real-world effects on the lives of profoundly autistic people like my son. And the second half of the book is comprised of 3 case studies illustrating how the intact mind is now baked into much disability policy and practice. The first case study examines the ongoing fight to eliminate 14C programs, historically known as sheltered workshops, although the participants and families of participants that I spoke to really don't like that term anymore. And I'm sure everyone in this Zoom talk knows that 14C programs are authorized to pay a sub-minimum wage to some disabled participants based on their productivity. And the opposition to this, the move to close these facilities is motivated by the conviction that, quote, all individuals, including those individuals with the most significant disabilities, are capable of full participation in competitive integrated employment. And that's according to Employment First, the framework developed by the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the US Department of Labor and adopted by 38 states. As much as 14C has been under attack, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island have already closed their programs. Alaska, Maryland, Oregon, and Texas were in the process of doing so the last time I checked, and they might have succeeded since then. This model remains very popular among some intellectually disabled adults and their family members. One of the most shocking things I learned when I was doing research for my book was that in 2020, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights met to discuss the future of 14C, and they recommended eliminating it. But they also noted in the report that they got more comments through their public comment on this issue than they had gotten on any other issue they had discussed in the past, and that 98% of the almost 10,000 comments they received were in favor of preserving it. So virtually everybody wanted to keep it, and they still recommended to eliminate it. The next chapter focuses on the erosion of guardianship, which has been described by Teresa DeJeanette, pictured here, the chair of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the thalidomide baby, as a human rights violation comparable to, quote, slavery and genital mutilation, because every person, the United Nations asserts, is considered capable of making his or her own decisions. The UN has been a key driver in the movement to abolish guardianship since 2006, when Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which I heard Harris Capps talking about right before we started the session, the UN, the CRPD says, quote, persons with disabilities enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others in all aspects of life, including the right to control their own finances and secure bank loans and mortgages. They go into pretty specific detail. When most signatories of the convention, unsurprisingly, treated this article as something to be taken, I don't know, aspirationally, metaphorically, certainly not literally, the CRPD issued its first general comment, which emphasized that, in fact, they were not kidding. All substitute decision-making regimens must be abolished. That's a quote from the comment. The CRPD has received much pushback on this issue, unsurprisingly, because it is completely detached from the reality of profound autism and other types of significant cognitive impairment. And to date, only 3 out of the 180 countries that ratified the CRPD are officially in compliance. And my third case study analyzes the resurgence of facilitated communication, which I'm sure you remember is an intervention in which a non-disabled facilitator helps a severely cognitively impaired person spell out messages on a letterboard or keyboard by providing physical support at the hand, wrist, elbow, or shoulder, or merely just holding the letterboard as you see in this image. Although dozens of controlled studies dating back to the 1990s conclusively demonstrated that output in FC was controlled by the facilitator, not the disabled user, FC has come roaring back through variants known as the rapid prompting method, or RPM, and spelling to communicate, S2C. Studies report that RPM is now more frequently used in schools in evidence-based interventions like PECS. In the past year, letterboard users have been platformed at the highest levels of the scientific community, including the Interagency Coordinating Committee, the Association of University Centers on Disabilities, and the National Institutes of Health. And they've also graduated from prestigious universities like Berkeley and UCLA with facilitation. And I expect this to get even worse. There's a pro-FC movie making the rounds of film festivals right now, and I think it might be available through streaming if you want to check it out. It's called Spellers. It's based on a book written by the famous anti-vax advocate J.B. Handley and produced by Jenny McCarthy that suggests there is a brilliant mind hidden in every autistic person, no matter how severe they may appear. So thank you very much for having me today, and thank you even more for everything you all do and you've all done and continue to do to support the intellectually and developmentally disabled like myself. And this is my contact info. I'm happy to take questions now. I'm happy to take questions if they occur to you later. And I'm very invested in building community among families who love someone with a severe intellectual or developmental disability. So feel free, please, to connect on Facebook or Twitter, and come join us at the National Council on Severe Autism.
Yeah, thank you. That was terrific, and I am going to get your book and read it. And I've heard a lot of these things before. And one book that made a big impression on me about autism was one written by, I think, the brother of somebody who had committed suicide, who had been in what's his name's school or whatever.
Oh, Bruno
Um,
Bettelheim School.
Yes,
Yeah,
and it was just Bettelheim's background was in art history.
right. Yeah.
Just just amazing. And I knew parents in the my son Danny, who has passed away. He passed away in January or October, but he was born in 1976. So I knew a lot of these parents of autistic kids who had been accused of being refrigerator mothers and that sort of
Yeah.
thing. And they many of them came up with the, the same idea. If it was because I was cold and couldn't emotionally relate to my child, why is it that I have 4 other children who are just fine?
Yeah.
And yeah, it was just brutal. And my sons have my son Ian has severe cerebral palsy, and some similar things go on with this group, except that with really severe cerebral palsy, you can't deny that there's something really wrong when a child can't get a spoon to their mouth and feed themselves, or they start getting contractures and they're all twisted up and whatever. And then when you have CAT scans that show abnormal brains, and you have a history of a child who was deprived of oxygen at birth, and you have all of these things leading up to the cause of the intellectual and physical disabilities. At my son's school, we once had a workshop on IEPs, and there weren't too many parents there, but there was a man there who was the father of an autistic child, and he was the most tense person I have ever met. He was, and the parents from High Point had pretty much accepted the fact that they knew what their children were like, and they weren't expecting a cure or necessarily even much improvement. And they'd be happy to have had that happen, but it wasn't necessarily going to happen. But this man, the father of the autistic child, had been fed all of these ideas that, he was sometime he was going to be able to find this child locked inside. And I think the child was going through ABA, and the father just was very disturbed by the fact that his son would only eat things that were white. So noodles and crackers and that kind, and they couldn't get him to eat anything green. And this was just driving him nuts. And that if they only did the ABA therapy more hours a day, instead of 8 hours a day, they did it 10 hours a day, maybe he would improve. But it was just interesting to see the difference between, the High Point parents had a lot of things they were dealing with, and yet they seemed relatively relaxed and accepting of what their lives were like. And this man had a lot of trouble. I mean, it was just really amazing to see this other, the way he approached his son. So anyway, but thank you. That was a very good talk. I will buy your book.
Thank you, Jill. And I'm very sorry to hear about your son. I do want to say there was a lot in what you said, but I'm just going to respond to this, which is there's a whole section in the book about cerebral palsy, because it's also at this moment in the mid 20th century when doctors finally realize that actually some people with cerebral palsy do have an intact mind, that they had been institutionalized, considered profoundly cognitively impaired, but it was only because they couldn't communicate at all, because they had such gross motor impairments. And when they figured out that some, not all of course, but had normal or above average intelligence, that was shocking to people. I mean, this was 1950, it's right around the time when Christy Brown writes My Left Foot, and suddenly everyone's thinking, well, maybe this intact mind thing is for real, that we can't tell based on someone's behavior or their actions whether or not they are intellectually disabled or not. So the kind of this discovery about cerebral palsy is also one of the factors identified as driving this intact mind discourse in autism, even though of course we know it's very different.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. And that is true. Yeah. But at some point, you come to the understanding that this big breakthrough that's supposed to happen
Yeah.
probably isn't going to happen. And there are all kinds of indications for why that's true. You know, for if a child has not figured out any kind of communication. I mean, my Danny could scream, and we just knew that he was unhappy. And that was about as far as his communication went, or that he was happy. And that was, you know.
Yeah, with this resurgence of facilitated communication we're seeing with, I know parents of autistic adults who are now doing this. I think that a lot of autistic parents never give up that belief that the intact mind is inside, you know. But let me just, Hugo, do you want to call on people? Do you want me to call on people? I see. All right, I'm just going to go in order on my screen. So Cindy.
Hi there, sorry. I have a daughter who's 19 years old, well, almost 20 now, and she's nonverbal and has autism, and I would say severe autism. So thank you so much for the NCSA, because we really have been shut out of any kind of social media discourse.
Yeah.
You know, the trolls come out if there's anything that you say. It's ridiculous. It's a battle. It's a fight. You know, the politics of autism are just crazy. But yeah, and you're right. I do think that for years, you know, we did kind of chase sort of a quote cure for her, because she's a triplet. I have triplets, and she's the only daughter that, you know, has any kind of intellectual disability or issues of that sort. So it's always like, well, what happened with her? You know, is there something? But yeah, it's fascinating to me. And when people try to say that someone with autism or her level of autism, oh, they could do anything if they just have the right support. Right. It's nuts to me. And we also had an MRI and a functional MRI done for her, and found that basically she's got low levels of serotonin and dopamine that go into her brain. So it's kind of like her brain developed normally, but her language center never moved where it was supposed to move to. So it's fascinating to me. And I'm always thinking, you know, the people that spout this nonsense that, oh yeah, it's just, you know, they could do whatever in the community if they have this or that supporting them. It's like, you can't replace those things. You know, we're working with a neurologist trying to, you know, add and try to help her, but it's just fascinating. So again, just thank you for the work that you're doing. It's very important, because we do feel like our experience is being erased. Her experience is being erased, and it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree. And that's really why I wrote this book, to show how this assumption of the intact mind is resulting in a huge mismatch between the service provision and what people like your daughter and my son need, you know. So anyway, and I just also wanted to add, I was the same way when my son was little. I don't know any autism parent who didn't go down that rabbit hole of like alternative treatments, because, and to go to Jill's point about being settled and accepting, you know, on the contrary, I think parents of autistic children, especially when they're younger, are driven by this absolute panic that if we don't try this hyperbaric oxygen treatment, auditory integration training, vitamins, chelation, whatever. What if it sounds crazy? I spent 40 hours in a hyperbaric oxygen tube with my son and thinking, this is insane, you know, but what if that was the thing and I didn't do it, you know? So yeah, I would say that there's a lot of panic, especially when kids are younger, before parents get to that acceptance, like we did try everything and nothing worked, and this is my son and I love him, and I'm not doing him any favors by pretending that he's not intellectually disabled.
Right.
Marty.
Hi, thank you very much, Amy. I just wanted to point out how painful it can be to parents and family members when the intact mind concept comes up, and you know, we just got to get through to it. My brother Tommy was in a facility not far from us, and frequently people who worked there would take him home for a holiday on the theory that if he were in a homey environment, he'd open up.
Yeah.
And I don't think there were many other of these, you know, open up to the intact mind attempts made, but it was very painful for my parents to have someone implying that it was their fault and Tommy needed the right kind of environment. And I don't think you can blame the parents. Mine didn't get their hopes up when these things happened. They were pretty convinced of the situation, but I don't think you can blame parents for trying things, for getting their hopes up. You always will. And so, as you said, however unlikely it sounds, you try it. But
Right.
every attempt is very painful for the family.
Yeah, I don't blame hope at all. I mean, we had that hope, and you need that hope, that hope is totally normal and natural. The problem is when you build that system, you build an entire service system on the kind of the ideal of the intact mind. Again, that's my argument, that you close down the intensive disability specific settings that our kids really need, and make the kind of crazy arguments like fantasies. You spin this fantasy that anybody with any kind of intellectual developmental disability needs is their own apartment and their own competitive minimum wage job, when we all know here that there are many people that model doesn't fit. So I don't blame the parents, of course not. I've been there, but from the service sector point of view, adopting this idea has been very detrimental and continues to be really harmful in the kind of the closure of the settings that our kids need.
I think it's also painful for the kid to keep getting put through all this stuff.
Yeah,
respect their situation and let them live their life.
exactly. Yeah, maximize happiness. That's all. The parents I know of older kids, we're all it's just about happiness, right? We just want our kids to be happy. What makes them happy? Sesame Street makes my son happy. He's 24. Do I care? Not at all. Everyone in my house goes around quoting Sesame Street now. It's just part of our family brand. But I used to think I wish he would watch something more age appropriate. Now I'm just happy he has something that he cares about and is able to access on his own. I don't know how much you know about me, but I actually went back, got my PhD in the history of medicine really recently. I just defended my dissertation a year ago. So, but I did it because I was really interested in the history of how we got here to this extraordinarily fraught autism community, all the infighting, so I think history is an amazing tool to understanding. I learned so much. And I do talk about eugenics in the first chapter of my book and the impact on that discourse, more on people with intellectual disabilities than people with autism. But yeah, it's fascinating. So good luck with your book. I look forward to seeing it. Mickey, hi.
Okay, Amy, thank you. You are the hero to many of us. I think you know that by now. But my main question is for all of us. With the political system, what are we doing about the politics in DC? Because they are overrun by the ideologues. In ACL, wherever we go, we are so outnumbered. What are we going to do with this democratic agenda? What can we do quickly to stop this before we lose everything? And I'm extraordinarily depressed because I'm of the older generation. My son just turned 51. I just turned 1 week ago today, I turned 80. So my son is okay. But look at you and all of your friends. What is going to happen to all these other people? And it's very painful. What can we do politically? Because we're outnumbered in DC. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and happy birthday, Mickey. Lifelong Democrat here who's never been pushed more to the center than by the crazy disability policy. And, I do a lot of, at NCSA, we do a lot of advocacy work, and I do a lot of advocacy work in Pennsylvania. And all I can say is, we have to keep fighting. We have to keep, I think the number one thing is just making sure our elected representatives understand what severe autism and other types of severe intellectual and developmental disability look like, that we're not talking about. I mean, they are getting autistic self-advocate, neurodiversity advocates coming into their office who are like college graduates and married and are talking about how awful, you know, institutions are and how all anybody wants is full inclusion. And that sounds great. And it's warm and fuzzy. It's cheaper. There isn't anything that policymakers don't like about that narrative. But we have to show them that that doesn't fit everybody. I mean, I think that it's great that this profound autism term is catching on, and the CDC just released these numbers that about a third of the autism population in this country meets the criteria for profound autism, which is an IQ less than 50 and based no language or minimal language and requiring round-the-clock care. And I think that I just wish that every representative could either like have a family bring their severely autistic kid into their office, or that they see there's a video that NCSA was involved in the making of. It was mostly by Gloria Satriali, who is on the board of NCSA, but also has a program in Pennsylvania where my son goes. And it's called, if you Google Act Now for Severe Autism, it'll take you to the YouTube page, or it has its own page. It's also on YouTube. It's 7 minutes. It's really disturbing to watch. It shows my son's in that video. It shows people with severe autism engaged in some really challenging behavior. It's there for advocacy use for anybody, just to show people this is what we're talking about. This is the type of, you know, we need to support this individual safely and maximize their quality of life, you know? So we're going to, thank you, Hugo. We're going to, you know, keep fighting. And, you know, there's work now to try to disrupt or change the Autism Cares Act is up for renewal, where I'm part of a coalition that's trying to change, like have a carve out for profound autism. There's all kinds of advocacy work going on. And all I can say is just keep fighting. I really believe that, you know, the discourse has become so unhinged from reality that at some point it has to start coming back to the center and recognizing that people have these really profound needs. And it might take something really horrible happening, you know, that where people say like this model doesn't fit. We need, you know, a broader range of models. And I know Mickey, you fight for that every day, and everyone else on this call does too. And I really appreciate it, but there is going to be no quick, is that the NCSA?
Yeah.
There is going to be no quick change, but I feel like, you know, there could be some more incremental change. I'm hopeful in Pennsylvania, and if we can change things in Pennsylvania, then we can change them anywhere, as far as I can tell. Jill, do you have another question?
When I was talking about the difference between the autistic parent and the people from my son's school, I didn't want to give the impression that we were any more virtuous than this. Man, it's just that because parents like me who had children functioning at the age of infants, and if you can just imagine having taken care of an infant for 10 years who just keeps growing,
Yeah.
And doesn't necessarily progress in other ways. So it's just mostly that I think the High Point parents were just too tired.
Yeah.
It's like people talked about patterning all the time, and
Oh my God. Yeah, I know all about
when
that.
Danny was very young, and I mean, it was like hours of just putting a child through these movements, and it was easy to convince myself that I was too tired.
Yeah.
So
I was not
how I gave-
suggesting. I did not think you were making any such claim. I think all the parents, you know, have been through the ringer, and we all just try to do the best that we can. And if anything, I feel like, and one other problem with this intact mind narrative is it just recapitulates as parent blaming, like that we thought we got rid of that with Bettelheim, but now it's our fault if our kids are not able to live independently or work independently. We're holding them back somehow, you know, like they could be communicating if we would only hold a letterboard in front of them, or like just, you know, they could work at Walmart if only we just weren't so overprotective and so neurotic. So like it's that mother blaming discourse has never left us. And so I know you're out of time. I just want to thank you so much for having me. This has been such a great conversation. I also want to just ask you a tremendous favor. I cringe inside to do this, but I'm kind of required by my press, which is that if you do read the book, and if you wouldn't mind leaving just a brief review on Amazon, the people really pay attention to that. And the more that, you know, kind of buzz builds up around the book, the more likely that people are going to pay attention to the argument that's in it. So Thank you so much. And Hugo, thanks for giving me this opportunity to talk about my book.
Amy,